So here I am breaking down every season of Total Drama and looking at who I believe is the best player strategically from each season. What's up everybody, this is Willie and today I'm back talking about Total Drama. But I want to talk about an interesting concept where I go through each season and look for who I think is the best player from that respective season. And before continuing on, I want to give a shout out to Plushroom Kingdom, who made a video similar to this idea where he went through each Total Drama season and give his opinion on the best and worst characters from each season. So it kind of inspired me for this video, but I wanted to focus more from the strategy aspects because I love Survivor. So this is more so on an assessment on which character had the best game from each season. So that's what I'm going to do here for this video, and I'm actually going to do a separate video where I'm going to be talking about who is the worst player from each season, so stay tuned for that. But here I'm going to be going through seasons from the first to the latest season, and I will not be including Redonkulous Race because that's a whole different competition and it mostly would be relating to the Amazing Race, so that'll be not included. But now before I go any further, I may as well disclose my criteria of how I assess who is the best player without factoring too much bias into it. Players who are able to distribute an essence of strategic and social prowess alongside being well insulated in the game, or who I would assess play the best. Alongside those factors, they should also be players who don't rely on any sort of twists or immunities that needed to lock them out of a precarious position they would be in. Because if any sort of player is in that spot, it is harming to them as a player, which I will acknowledge a lot about certain players in this video. So yeah, being the best player is avoiding something like that and displaying some game sense along the way on that individual season. Hey, we got 8 seasons to look through, so let's get right into it. So off the bat, we're already starting with Total Drama Island, the original, and because it's the biggest cast, it's just a jumbled mess on who really is playing the game. So I really narrowed it down to 3 of the final 5, which are surprisingly the non-finalists in Lashana, Duncan, and Heather, because it displayed more game prowess than the final 2 at all. Duncan is someone who I think really played pretty decently, made some strategic moves, especially building an alliance that would bring him to the merge and also help him a survival round over Bridget, but I just think his overall threat level wasn't managed, so there's that. And then there's Heather, who was very close to making it, being clearly the true mastermind of the season, but here's some problems with her game, is the fact that she had some luck-based circumstances that kept her going, or else she would have been booted much earlier than before, especially points where she needed immunity, especially the Trent round where she would have just went home if she didn't get that immunity. I think she's still a great player and still one of my personal favorites, but her game on this specific season was just not enough to crack the top. So who am I gonna pick? Well, it's gonna shock you. It's Lashana. Why? Because she had somewhat strategic influence in the game, being able to use some of her social bonds to maintain her position in the game, where really no one outside of Heather was targeting her, and even then, even if Heather tries to get her way, I don't think anyone would listen to her on that right, because Lashana had more allies on her side than any other targets that Heather managed to get out. And it goes without saying that Lashana is completely one of the most screwed over players, since I don't think she was destined to go out in the final 5 if it played out normally. If it wasn't for a stupid twist where the losers would vote someone out, Lashana is definitely an endgamer, and I don't put too much fault for her for even being voted out in the spot because the eliminated players missed her, because by that fact, it means that she was very well liked on the island and indicates that she had such strong social capital that makes me believe that yeah, she really was dominating in the game. So this is why I would have Lashana as the best player of Total Drama Island. Next is Total Drama Action, and full disclosure, I haven't rewatched this season for quite a bit, so my memory has kind of waned, but from what I can recall, I can say 3 of the top 4 definitely played very strong games, in the likes of Courtney, Duncan, and Beth, so the field really narrows down to them. And so here's gonna be a weird take. Duncan is someone that, yes, he makes it to final 2 and did seem to have somewhat decent navigation to the end. There's also the aspect that he got lucked out because Lindsay accidentally voted for herself in that one round, or else he would have been the likely boot, which is pretty damning on him as a player, where he still isn't able to manage his threat level good enough and only needed luck-based circumstances to really spare him in the game. So I'm not choosing him. And then it now comes down to Courtney and Beth, where dare I say this might be the wildest take only for the second season. I'm giving the floor to Beth, because I don't recall a moment where Beth was really in true danger and all, and she did have some strategic acumen in the game, willing to target people like Duncan in that one round, although she fails at it because her ally eliminated herself. Beth really did have some influence into making sure that she was able to get threats out. And don't get me wrong, Courtney was the mastermind of the season, and I don't dock too much against her just because she joined late into the game, but I will knock the fact that she, just like Duncan, didn't really manage her threat level good enough, where she kind of made herself too blatantly of a strategist that did make her a target near the end portion of the game. So this is why I would make the wild choice of having Beth over Courtney be the best player of the season. Now we jump forward to World Tour, and oh my gosh, this is a jumbled mess. There are a few strategic players, but also at the same time, their games on their own right weren't really that great either. So yeah, narrowing down the candidates, I'm obviously picking the final two, because quite frankly, who's a better player than them? I'm also going to make another wild take in the fact that I also consider Sierra, where yeah, she is crazy and was stalking Cody, but at the same time, there was points that she displayed a strategic mind, especially when she avoided falling under Heather's spell, which, I mean, to be fair, she was aware of who Heather is as a player since she watched the seasons before joining the cast. But still, it really shows that although Sierra does stalk Cody for the most part, she does focus on the game as well and recognizes her optimal play in order to maintain her position, like targeting Gwen and targeting Heather. And where by that point, there wasn't really any situation where she was in true danger, besides Cody just actively voting for her just because she kept stalking him. But it's just Cody, so whatever. And the way she goes out isn't even because she was voted out, was because it was retribution for her accidentally blowing up Chris's plane, so he chose to eliminate her as a result of it, despite her being immune. But really, the top two here have the most stable strategic minds, where obviously Alejandro is a mastermind in this season, playing people like fiddles, while Heather is also someone who's able to plot some people against him and also make good of herself to have people gravitate to her as a number to pull in on their side, like we saw when she was in the middle of a clear divide in Team Amazon. But for the problems with these two is that they both were essentially voted out and needed to be locked out by some kind of twist or some sort to keep them in the game. But for the best player, I have to give it to Heather, because yes, she was voted out on that one round, but that's in the case where Chris already had planned it to be a non-elimination round, so at least it was set up in advance, where in comparison to Alejandro, if it wasn't for Sierra blowing out the plane, he would have been gone. And on that case, it was Chris's last second decision on choosing to eliminate Sierra, which in itself was never planned to begin with, since no one would know that that would happen. So although Alejandro had more strategy involved than Heather, I do feel like Heather's positioning was able to outmatch him by the end of it, so I give it to her. Now back on the island with Revenge of the Island with the fresh new cast, and it's another one that's sort of a jumbled mess, but for me, the top player really is narrowed down to the final four, because I think they had some merits to their game, where obviously we got Scott, who displayed the most strategic prowess throughout the game. However, because of the introduction of idols in this season, and because people were trying to get him out, he did need idols to save himself at points where he should have been going home, so that really knocks him off of contention of being the best. So then for the top three, and I'm just get right to the get-go, I'm gonna select Cameron because he was very likable, and as we saw, everyone subtract Joe was rooting for him to win, so it really shows how much of a positive reputation he has brought into the game. Also, I do think he worked very well with some players like Zoe, who he was able to work with to get rid of Scott. I think that's really good on him as a player. And then comparing to the other two, Zoe was a fine player, definitely the second best this season, especially when she made optimal moves when needed to, like the round where she had to vote Dakota out over Scott when he played a night on himself. And then Lightning, where really he did need to win that final 3 round in order to get to the final 2, or else if anyone else won, he would have been gone. So I do fault him on that right. And going back to the final challenge, only one person was rooting for him, which really goes to show how in a scenario where there would be a voting process, he would have been dead in the waters if he was up against Cameron. So yeah. So then we got Total Drama All-Stars, which again was a disaster of a season. So it does lead to a lot of my choice here being not 100% solid, but still the best I can assess based on how their gameplay was in the season. So with that, my choice really comes down to the top two, Mike and Zoe. But I'll give an honorable mention to Alejandro, who was able to sniff out that Mal was in the game which goes to show some of his correct reads, but he does also fail to try and convince people that Mal is existing in the game, which is an indictment on his end, partially due to his reputation, which is a fault on his own right. So then for the top two, I mean clearly the answer I'm gonna have to go with is Zoe, which I know she was very frustrating this season, but she didn't play that bad. She was never in any semblance of danger or going home really at all, and that is Zoe in general with the seasons that she competes on, where she makes such deep runs where she's rarely targeted, and considering she has the highest placing for any multi-time player, really is indicative of her good gameplay, which there could be a serious argument that Zoe is one of the best players of Total Drama, but we'll see if I eventually get around to doing a player ranking. But for me, the circumstance with picking her over Mike is the fact that Mike wasn't even in game for the most part, where Mal was impersonating him once he took over his body. So really, I can't even give an assessment on Mike's game because he wasn't even in it for most part. And yeah, let's just say how Mal was impersonating him, he still wasn't in a precarious position. However, he started damaging Mike's reputation, which was further putting a bullseye on his back. And the only credit I'll give to Mal's impersonation of Mike is the fact that, well, because Zoe was already aware of who Mal was, she still knew Mike was inside him and didn't want to take out Mike in the chance that he came back. But besides that, on that front, I still think Zoe did have more of the influence in the game and maintained most of the control, so I'm gonna give it to her. Then we go to Pahkitew Island, and once again, I'm narrowing the candidates to the final four because really everyone this season is pretty bad, but let's make it clear, I'm not going to pick Sugar because she made herself way too blatant of a threat, and in the position where she is at, if it played out in the normal round, no one was going to take her to the final two, so yeah, and even the most damning part was that she failed on her own minigame. So then we got the final two plus Jasmine, and dare I say, I think Jasmine might be the best player of the season just because she has some very well-rounded maneuvers as well as using her social bonds with others so where they want to use her as a number. I really feel like I don't have much negatives about Jasmine's games besides the fact that obviously the way she was booted was not one where I would fault her too much because it was a challenge-based elimination, not in the formal way of voting someone out. And in contrast with Sean and Sky, Sean, he's an okay player, but he definitely didn't make a lot of the strategic moves in the season. And then for Sky, where she did have a strategic mind at points, there's also the circumstance where she was almost voted out and only lucked out because Dave voted himself, or else if he voted for her, she would have been bye-bye. So really, although Jasmine is the best player despite being a non-finalist, I do praise her social prowess and likability that got her pretty far into the game, without needing some semblance of luck or coasting to get her far. And now we finally approach the reboot seasons. So starting with the first reboot season, I think what interests me is how well game body most of this cast is, which is why I have a lot of praise for how the reboot seasons played out because we had more strategically minded cast members. So it does make an interesting field of players I could choose from, but for me, I narrowed it to the final four, where I'll go through each of them. Let's start off with Millie, who did have a very strong ally in Priya, but also made some very self-interested moves, such as voting out Scary Girl over Whipper, which was confirmed by Bowie, which although shows how she's willing to play in that kind of fashion, also was pretty questionable that she would be willing to ruin her relationship with Priya. And as we saw with her note-taking, it would be the material that would put a rift in her relationship with Priya, so that part is pretty bad. And then with Julia, she is a very savvy player, but I do think one, the criteria of being the best player cannot always be reliant on immunities when needed, and Julia is in that spot where she was reliant on immunity wins to avoid elimination, and once she finally was vulnerable, she would be taken out. So then it now comes down to the top two of Bowie and Priya, where Bowie is the much more strategically minded player, while Priya is the more challenge-based and socially adept, so it was kind of a tough choice between the two. But based on my criteria, where although you might be a strategic mind, you also have to have strong social cues that maintains a good position, which Bowie does unfortunately fail to do so because he was in danger at points. That means the winner in Priya is also the best player of the season, because she was not really in much of a precarious position throughout her season, unlike Bowie, where there were times that he was on the chopping block and only got saved by other players actively playing bad for themselves. So although the two were really close, I just have to give the edge to Priya. And now we're on to the second reboot season, also the final season for this video, and we have just an equally amount of game plotty players this season. But once again, which I don't know how this becomes a common trend, the candidates for top player comes down to the final 4. So let's get right to the get-go. Caleb was a bit of a mess, but he somehow was able to make it far into the game, so I can give it to him on that front, especially with the reputation of him being the previous season's first boot. And then we got Priya, who I think played as equally of a good game as well, especially coming in after being the former winner of the previous season. She somehow was able to make it to Final 4 again, is indicative of her strong plays. But what doesn't make her crack among the best for this season in particular is that she kind of loses control at the end and eventually has Julia dominate her strategically wise, so that does kind of harm her game on this season, where she essentially peters out at the end. But the fact that she was able to maintain such a strong position despite the reputation it's had really is something to be impressed by. So then we have the top 2 in Julia and Wayne, where straight up, the top player is Wayne, where he was very likable, had a lot of people on his side when it was the finale, and also did not seem to be in danger whatsoever. While I really wanted to select Julia, there's also some damning parts to her as a player, where the final 4 round is the biggest knock against her, where she should have been going home. However, she had an idol that saved her, but with that thought that if she didn't have that idol, she would have been straight up gone. And that's the biggest indictment on her as a social player, where she is savvy, but also she is one that can get into lots of rivalries and conflicts with others where no one is willing to take her to the end. And the fact that she almost got 4th place twice is a demonstration how Julia is in a position where no one is really willing to bring her to the end because how much of a savvy and competition threat she is. Yes, she did dominate most of the game that season, but I do think player-wise, Wayne had more social intelligence and adapted to the game much more impressively. So while I like Julia more and would have picked her for bias reasons, from the perspective of who played the better game, Wayne was a much more well-rounded player in the grand scheme of things because his navigation was less rockier than Julia's. That's everything I've got to say, and feel free to comment down below if you agree with who I selected, or even feel interested to share your own opinions on who you think is the best player from each season. Tap that subscribe button if you want to see more Total Drama related videos, and like I said at the beginning of the video, I will make the polar opposite version of this video, which is going to be the worst players of each Total Drama season, so keep your eyes out for that. With all this being said, I appreciate each and every one of you tuning in, and I'll see you all in the next video.